this computer. Cool. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Kubernetes Cluster API Azure, our weekly office hours meeting. We do this every Thursday at 9 o'clock Pacific time. As you are probably aware, we are a sub-project of SIG Cluster Lifecycle, and as such, we abide by the general Kubernetes community rules of conduct, which you can read about. I think we have it linked somewhere. But basically, as you know, it boils down to let's try and make this a welcoming space for everyone. Try not to talk over each other. Use the raise hand feature in Zoom so that we don't talk over each other. And that's about it. This is the time of the meeting where we can welcome new people. I am pretty confident we don't have anyone, so I'm going to skip over that. I don't think I'm forgetting any of the preamble. But yeah, so let's move on to open discussion. First topic is kind of self-evident, public service announcement that we got our 1.15.0 release out on schedule, which is great. There's a bunch of stuff in there, including some stuff John's going to demo next, and also we're up to date with Cappy, which is nice, and we have a couple patch releases. And then Lily, do you want to say anything about the test infra PR? I'm a little. There's a lot of changes we have to make in test infra, and I'm not sure this covers them all. Is all I was thinking.
Yeah, that's kind of why I put it here, because the release notes guide didn't really, it pointed to like a really old PR, and there's a lot of changes in there. I'm not sure which changes are needed. I just changed one of the files because I saw for 1.14 the PR only changed one file. So I'm just not sure what I'm supposed to be changing, because there's like files from like cloud provider Azure and other like repos that reference release like CAPZ releases, but I'm not sure if we're supposed to be changing that. So yeah, I guess some help here or just some reviews would be good, and just get it in.
Anybody have any guidance there? I'm kind of looking at you, Jack, because maybe you did this last time, or there's some trade-off between like updating every test infra job that we potentially could, or breaking into like maybe we don't want to force that on cloud provider Azure, or am I misremembering how this went last time?
Yeah, I mean, I think the guidance is just that we'll do a slow rollout. I don't think there's the key thing we want is to not fall too far behind, because then we're asking downstream testers to rely on something that we ourselves aren't regularly testing. So I think the first thing to do is update our tests so that the -1, the v1 beta 1, that's now point to v1.14, or release 1.14 branch instead of 1.13, and then audit the existing release 1.13 pinned tests and move those to 1.14. And then we can do the 1.14 to 1.15 move after that. That would be does that answer the question at all?
Just for CAPZ first, you're saying?
Well, the first thing would be to update our periodic tests so that we're testing against main and -1 current. The test infra -1, that's an alias that we manage, and it's currently pointing to 1.14. Sorry, it's currently pointing to 1.13.
Yeah.
It's too early for me to know the answer, but we need to rev that one version because we just cut a new main minor release. So I'm happy to partner with anybody on that.
Yeah, sure. I think I saw the previous PR just did the just rename the job files from like the old, so like the previous two releases. And that's kind of what I did, but if there's something I missed, just let me know.
Cool.
Cool, yeah. Could start with a periodic PR. And I'm happy to help too if you need more eyes. All right, I guess we can move on to John's demo. Take it away, sir.
All right. Thanks, Matt. I will get my screen going here.
Let me stop sharing. If I can figure out how to do that. Seriously, how do I stop sharing? Wow, this interface.
Well,
I
now
can also just start to share and it'll overwrite.
Oh, it's just the red button that, okay, there we go. Jeez.
yeah, I'm trying to do that. I'm not seeing where I can share my whole desktop, which is annoying, but we can do one at a time. I think that's fine. All right. So a few weeks ago, I announced we were starting a new work stream to add a new set of APIs to manage AKS clusters that are essentially a thin wrapper around ASO resources. And ASO provides CRDs and controllers for plain Azure resources. So that work is now basically complete and ready for folks to try out in the new CABZ 115. So I want to show a little bit of how that looks and how that works today. So as a little bit of a refresher on the background, the basic idea behind these new APIs is to leverage ASO as much as possible for the API definitions of Azure resources and the mechanics required to manage those in Azure. So this opens up CABZ to be able to represent any Azure resources that can be described by ASO. And because ASO generates its resource definitions from the Azure API specs directly, its CRDs include the full definition for the API versions of the resources it defines. So that is still a limited subset, but for things like managed cluster, if there is an API version for that, you'll get the whole thing and not a limited subset that CABZ has traditionally implemented. So this helps CABZ avoid a ton of feature and resource specific logic and allows us to passively expose new features that get implemented in the Azure API through upgrades of ASO as ASO continues to expand its service area in terms of API versions and the types of resources it supports. So then CABZ is almost exclusively concerned with being this very thin layer in between cluster API and ASO, which fulfills the cluster API infrastructure provider contract. So this is an example of what a resource looks like in the new API. Basically, you'll find that it is very minimal, where pretty much the main field is this spec.resources, which defines an array of literal ASO resources defined all the way through. So this includes the API version and kind. So you can use any API version you want that's available in ASO, and you can specify pretty much any resources you want in here. There are some very basic assumptions that CABZ has to make, like that an Azure ASO managed control plane does define a ASO managed cluster resource. But overall, CABZ tries to make as few assumptions as it can about what all actually goes in here. So yeah, that's basically how a resource generally looks. And I will show this kind of in action. So I will switch to my terminal if I can't figure out how to share my whole screen.
Yeah, I don't have that option either. Maybe new Zoom or something. Can't share a whole screen.
Yeah. All right, so here I have a full template up and running with, so this is essentially what you would get if you use the AKS-ASO flavor that we also ship in the release. So this includes everything but cluster, an Azure ASO managed control plane, Azure ASO managed cluster, and then machine pool, infra machine pool, a couple of those. So yeah, like I mentioned before, an Azure ASO managed control plane does define a managed cluster resource. And then the Azure ASO managed cluster defines the resource group, but technically I suppose you could also put this in the managed control plane. CABZ doesn't really care. And then the Azure ASO managed machine pool defines an ASO representation of an AKS agent pool. And then the machine pool looks pretty much the same as it always has. So basically the way, or maybe I'll pause there. Does anybody have any questions? I will check in on the chat. Cool. No questions so far. All right. So basically the way that CABZ operates with these resources is that it will, when we reconcile an Azure ASO managed cluster, it will basically loop through all of these resources and do a server-side apply of this definition onto the cluster. So basically anything that's defined in here, CABZ will assume is authoritative. And so I can do something like add a resource tag to this resource. And I can show if I get the status.tags for that ASO resource group, we have nothing. But then if I apply this template and then try to get those again, this should be pretty quick. And we see that it is there. So basically what you don't want to do is modify these ASO resources directly. Like if I applied to the resource group itself for any configuration that overlaps with this, because CABZ will overwrite that right away. And then another cool thing you can do is maybe I want to split all of my stuff in between two resource groups. So I can just throw in another resource group here with different name. And if I apply this template again, you can see that a new resource group does get created. And if you don't want that anymore, you can delete it and it will get deleted. So that seems pretty slick to me, I think. And then let's look at the Azure ASO managed cluster. So this is what the status looks like for each of these resources. Right now it's pretty minimal just because this is kind of what CABZ needs to function. But there are some gaps in here like status conditions we haven't quite fleshed out yet. We're still working on that. But the things you will find in here are any CAPI contract things, like the status.ready field is something that CAPI expects to exist on any infra cluster resource. And then there is this resources field, which describes for each of the resources that this CABZ resource is managing, whether or not that resource is ready, and then kind of a handle to that resource. So this is also kind of intentionally minimal. And the thinking right now is that if you do see that this is false and you want to figure out why that is, then this should provide enough information for you to look at the ASO resource yourself to see if there is any extra status there that would indicate what might be going wrong. Cool. And then I do have kind of a less minimalistic example, which shows a lot of things. So this is actually two clusters built from the same cluster class. And then each of these clusters shares its own, or they're both in the same resource group. So you can kind of split one cluster into many resource groups or have many clusters in one resource group. This resource group is actually managed not by any CABZ resource, but just as a separate resource because we wouldn't want to tie the life cycle of this resource group to one particular cluster here if both are existing in that same cluster. And then both of these clusters are also joined to an Azure fleet or an AKS fleet. And both of them also have a Kubernetes extension from the AKS marketplace. So this template just kind of shows a lot of things happening all at once. And this is the full YAML for that. I can throw this in a gist or something and share a link to that. I'll put that in the doc. Yeah, Matt, go ahead.
So I'm just kind of curious, how do we manage this standalone resource group? Is it just like a top level ASO definition on its own? Is that how that
Yep.
works?
Yep. So at the bottom here, so we have like our cluster resources. So this is all the regular CAPI stuff. And
Yeah.
then we also
Oh, there it
have
is.
this standalone resource group and fleet.
Oh,
But then
that's
you
so
can still
cool.
reference these by name in the Azure resources that exist embedded inside the CABZ resources. So I think this is something that you could do today with the current API, but just showing how this works with the new APIs.
Cool.
All right. Any other questions for the moment? All right. So next, one of the other new features in CABZ 115 is not really a feature, but documentation for how to adopt existing AKS clusters into CABZ for the existing Azure Managed Control Plane API and the related APIs there. And while that documented flow technically works, it's very manual and there are a number of limitations and footguns kind of inherent to that method. So these new ASO-based APIs make this use case way smoother, and we've built some automation to make that pretty seamless. So I'll switch to a new namespace. So the way that this works relies on ASO's native adoption capabilities, where if you specify an ASO resource that looks like something that already exists in Azure, at least kind of like the resource type and the name, then ASO will automatically start reconciling against that resource. So that allows you to basically have something that already exists in Azure, and then ASO, you can start managing that in ASO without having to really touch that existing resource at all. Yeah, go ahead, Jack.
Yeah, so that implies that the default flow for any ASO CRD create operation is a create if not exist. And
Correct.
so it's
Yep.
gonna create the ASO. It's gonna, yeah. Is there any option to fail if it exists? Or is that not implemented in ASO?
I don't think there's an option to fail, but there is an option to create the ASO resource, but not have ASO actively reconcile that resource definition that it knows about with what's actually in Azure. So it would still like pull down the status for that resource, but if you change the spec, it wouldn't actually do a put to Azure.
I see. Is that engaged via some annotation on the resource or something like
That's
that?
an annotation. Yep.
Cool. Thanks.
Yep. All right. So the practical steps here to adopt an AKS cluster are there are two steps, but you can combine them into one. The first step is to adopt the cluster into ASO. So I do have a template that describes a cluster that already exists. So this is only 3 resources, a managed cluster, an agent pool for that cluster, and a resource group. So ASO is working on finding those right now. And then the next step is annotating these resources with a magic annotation that CabZ looks at. So this whatever dash adopt annotation. And when CabZ sees a managed cluster or an agent pool with this annotation, it will start to automatically scaffold out all of the cluster API and CabZ resources that you need for that cluster. So I can do that now. So we added the annotation, and all of a sudden we can see a cluster, Azure ASO managed cluster, Azure ASO managed control plane, and we should see the machine pool pop up here shortly. So yeah, ideally these things would all kind of settle into some steady and successful state. And there, all of a sudden, once these things are all settled, I could do something like kubectl scale machine pool, and that would all work. And obviously we can see the cluster object here. So you can do anything that you can operate, or you can do against a cluster API or CabZ cluster. So there are a few limitations with this in terms of exactly how these automatically generated resources look, where if you want to tweak things like the names of these resources, that isn't super possible. But if you did want to really customize these things, you could still scaffold out the resources, the CabZ resources yourself like this, and essentially kind of copy paste your ASO definitions into CabZ, and that should all still work. That would adopt that cluster essentially. This is just kind of a shortcut for automating that process. One caveat I do want to mention is ASO does ship an ASO CLI, and it does have a super handy command to basically point at an Azure resource by an ARM ID, and it will pull down all of the associated ASO resources with that. So like if I point it at a resource group, then it will spit out a YAML that contains the resource group YAML and YAML for all of the resources inside that resource group. So that is a really handy way to kind of get going on scaffolding out all of these ASO resources. But the caveat there is that there are some bugs, at least related to managed clusters, where you do have to tweak that YAML a little bit by hand just to make it valid for the schema. And it's kind of easy stuff like changing casing and that sort of thing, which isn't super hard, but also isn't very satisfying. So I just wanted to caution about that. And Jack, I see you have your hand raised.
Well, first, can you, so that's an active bug with ASO. So when they fix that bug, then that will not, so that's a bug that is inherited by ASO consumers, like CabZ now.
Yep.
Cool. Can you show us what that adopt.yaml looks like that you applied?
Yes. So this is the full
Cool. So
YAML. I have,
this is fairly intimidating, but you got this by running the ASOCTL command, I assume, rather than
yes.
crafting that yourself.
Yeah, and you could tweak all the stuff by hand too. Like if you didn't really care about all this stuff, you could kind of delete whatever you didn't necessarily want specified in your CabZ resources beforehand. Because the way that the AKS API works, if you don't specify some of these fields, even if they're already defined, they won't get changed if you just choose not to send a value to those. So you could pare this down quite a bit from what ASO actually spits out here. Cool. Yeah, so that's mostly what I wanted to show. So overall, one other kind of theme with these APIs is that there are intentionally very few guardrails built in. And that's mostly to allow users as much flexibility as possible because it seems like every week we always find some new use case that we haven't thought of. And sometimes the mechanisms that we already have kind of get in the way of those things. So that was one thing that I wanted to try to get ahead of is what if we just build in very little guardrails and see what people want to and can do. And obviously we are super open to if folks do continue running into the same issues over and over again that we can get ahead of, then we would definitely be open to adding some of those. So yeah, very open to feedback on that. So along with the very few guardrails, the status reporting isn't super robust like I showed before. I'm not in the right namespace. So yeah, if you do find that something like isn't reconciling for a while, then the odds are that the controller logs are logging something. So that's where all of the error information definitely is. So if you hit any issues, make sure you check the CabZ controller manager logs. But we are working on kind of bubbling that status up to the resources themselves. So hopefully they'll be a little bit more visible there. All right, I think that's kind of all of the nitty-gritty stuff. So I did want to reiterate from last time that we currently don't have any plans to deprecate the existing APIs, but we are open to that possibility sometime down the road, depending on the feedback we get on these new APIs. So please try them out and let us know what you think. You can set the exp underscore ASO underscore API environment variable to true when you cluster CTL init your cluster. And that will set the feature flag to make all of this available. And that's stuff you can do right now with CabZ 115. So please try it out if this looks interesting to you. And please give us any feedback or report any bugs or anything. All right, I think that's all I had. Any last questions?
Willie,
Oh, I'm just clapping.
oh, you're clapping. Sorry. I can't tell. Yeah, that was really cool. That is I've heard you talk about this, but this is the first time I've actually seen it in action. EXP underscore ASO API. That's the flag. The
Yep,
environment for
I threw it right here. I can maybe add a note to that in the doc too. And I think it is documented in the docs too. And the docs are linked in the doc, I think already. Yeah, David, go ahead.
I was going to say you also are going to have a Helm chart for this, right? So I don't know if you want to call that out as well.
Yeah, well, I guess it's more your Helm chart repo than mine. But yeah, I did have a Helm chart to kind of help bootstrap some of this stuff that I've since moved over to customize with the rest of the templates in the CabZ repo. But yeah, I guess David, if you want to kind of generally plug the Helm repo, this stuff will be included in that.
Yeah. I mean, for GitOps scenarios, obviously the Helm chart makes life a lot easier working with like Argo or Flux for the Helm provider. So we under Matt's repo, we have what we're starting is a Helm chart repository for cluster API based workload charts. So, and we have two PRs up there now, one for kind of the current managed cluster provisioning template, and then one for the new V2 API. So yeah.
Cool.
awesome.
All right. Yep, that was all I had. I will hand it back to you, Matt.
Thank you. That was great. Guess I can reshare screen. I don't think we have any thing left on the agenda, unless somebody has something to bring up now. David, you're saying might be worth triaging stuff. You mean going over this queue?
Yeah, I think maybe next week we can do like a full milestone kind of scrub, but might be good to just kind of do a little grooming of PRs and backlog or issues for now.
Sure. These two are both draft PRs, so I don't think it's worth visiting them, right?
No, mainly just making sure that the needs review are have somebody assigned, and then the ones that are not in the wait on author state, to make sure we are doing what we need to do there.
I would move the workload identity to in progress. There are some gremlins there.
Okay. So then, wow, I guess this is actually ready for review. I think it is passing, or maybe it needs a rebase. All right, anyway, that is my thing. I will look at that today. And the bootstrapping extension, I don't know, we have people assigned to this. Is there anything to say about this one, Jack or Willie?
Yeah, I just assigned Jack to it for approval because they seem kind of eager to get it in, and they were asking who can approve it. I already gave it an LGTM.
Oh, so did it go through a refactor like we mentioned last week?
Yeah, because now it's just another explicit field to disable it because what they were doing before was to add a flag to just disable bootstrap or disable all extensions. But then you also have another field that you list VM extensions, so it doesn't really make too much sense. Because you can disable the extensions with this field, but then you have another list of extensions that is trying to reconcile. I mean, I think it's just simpler to, if you don't want extensions, you can just remove the field, like the other extensions field. And if you want to
Yeah,
disable
I think we discussed this. I don't actually agree with this. I think that this is essentially reopening the last PR, and we've already had that debate. I personally preferred the updated approach of removing all the extensions. That made sense in terms of the use case where there are certain OS implementations, VM implementations that don't support extensions.
Okay.
So sorry, I haven't had cycles to look into this. I don't know if there was a communication misfire there, but let's maybe get a conversation going with the authors so there's clarity here.
Uh-huh.
Does my position make sense? Like I feel like there's a PR in the history that did this, and
It did, yeah.
we discussed it and we decided not to do that. The updated approach made more sense from the perspective of some VMs can't run any extensions. So rather than allow this extension, which provides material value to the CAPZ bootstrapping experience and hooks into the cluster API contract super cleanly, rather than provide users an escape hatch from that, which doesn't make sense. Like we want to provide that integral contract, behavioral contract for every cluster that gets created. We don't want that to be disableable. But it does make sense to disable. I know it might sound like semantics, but I feel like if I'm a user exploring the configurable surface area, the fact that something that is fulfilling a core CAPI contract, which allows the status to move from provisioning to provisioned, is disableable would be confusing. And so I want to not confuse users about that, but rather focus on the fact that with this contract currently provided with a VM extension, we actually exclude certain VM types from using CAPZ at all because they can't support extensions. So I'd rather have
Okay.
that be the configurable source. I've been talking for a long time. I'm open to other opinions on this, obviously. So does anyone else have
That
a
makes,
different opinion?
yeah, I just, I remember we had this conversation and, like, I think I wasn't sure what a new like flag was doing, but then when I reviewed it, like it just seemed like it's doing the same thing as disabling the extension like itself, because you won't make sense to like just disable like all the extensions, but then also specify the VM extension field. But I didn't think about like the semantics I think that you mentioned. So I think I would agree, and maybe we can let them like unrefactor it, which it might be a little annoying, but that's on me for not understanding the difference between like, I mean, the fields are essentially doing the same thing, but I was just worried about two separate fields in the spec conflicting, but I don't think that should be a problem. If we want to like, we don't want to encourage the users to just disable this, so yeah.
Well,
I
I'm
think,
thinking from two perspectives. I'm thinking from the perspective of someone who's simply eager to explore configuration options. And I think what this VM extension is doing, like the VM extension is just an implementation detail that's acting on behalf of a sort of distributed behavioral contract between the Azure VM and the cluster API status so that they can agree, essentially have a handshake that like, I have been successfully bootstrapped. KubeADM has given me a successful terminal state. So it's a way of calling back to the CAPI and CAPC surface area to agree upon that terminal state.
yeah,
So that behavior has value in terms of production at scale. It's maybe going to be 3, 4 nines in terms of like what percentage of KubeADM failures are going to get to a certain point and then fail with no signal. It's a low percentage, but it's definitely a material value to those customers. So I don't want to mix this with the idea that it is that you can turn it off and on. Because the reason that you would turn it off and on is not because you don't want that behavior. The reason that that these submitters want it to be turned off and on is because they can't use extensions. So if that's the reason why you would disable it, then I think it's better expressed as in terms of the configuration surface area as turn off extensions, rather than disable this only extension that we're using, which has the side effect of disabling extensions on the VM. That's a little too indirect in terms of what the purpose here is. The purpose is I need to shut off. So if I'm a user and I know like, oh, I can't use extensions, I think I would have a better experience exploring, if I'm looking up through the CAPC configuration surface area, if there's a flag that says disable VM extensions, right away, that's what I need. Does that make sense? Whereas if I need to disable
that makes
VM
sense.
extensions and there's a configuration that says disable bootstrapping VM extension, I'm like, is that what I need? Like, I don't care about the bootstrapping VM. I just need to, you know what I mean? And then I'm thinking like, what other extensions do I need to disable? Because I need to disable all extensions. So it just becomes a little bit less clear what's actually going on under the hood.
Yeah,
Does
that makes
this all
sense.
make sense?
Yeah,
I know it's nitpicky, but
no, I think it's
okay.
important, and we definitely don't want users to be just disabling this extension and then also trying to add other extensions, and so yeah, I guess
Does anyone else have any different thing? I really do want to. It's possible that I'm not seeing the full picture here, but cool.
okay, so do you want to like add a comment to this, or should I just like let them know because if you go through, there are like comments from their side that talked about like wanting to do the refactor into this,
Okay, yeah, cool. I'll make some time today to do that.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Sorry to sidebar this for so many minutes.
Is that, yeah, I don't want to like be like, oh, I told them to do one thing and then like tell them to go back on it. But that is on me though. So, but yeah, thanks for explaining, Jack.
I mean, we're all allowed to change our minds.
Yeah.
It's part of software engineering and part of being a human. So.
All right. Oops. On tab. Okay, so I think we have a handle on these two needs reviews. Wait on author. This is really more needs review, but that's fine. Anything you want to say about these ones? Actually, this is really more the go auto rest thing is more of an in progress than waiting on author because there's not just some little tweaks to be made. Sorry, go ahead, Lily. You raised your hand.
No problem. Wait, does it add UX or workload identity? Like I remember that's been open for a while. Is that still
Yes.
waiting on someone
It's just waiting on me to resurrect it and see what parts of it are still useful and what doc changes are around it.
Okay, yeah, because I know Ashutosh was probably not working on it anymore, so I just want to make sure someone's doing it.
Yeah, no, I'm taking it over, but I just have not found time to do so. Practice.
Okay, got it.
Go ahead and kick it over to me, Matt. It's probably no longer relevant with the other work we've been doing, and I'm working on the other big workload identity PR. So
You sure? Okay.
yeah.
All right. How do I unassign myself now? Maybe that did it. Okay. I don't know what this one is. This is just, I had some minor comments for Jonathan, questions really, so this should be able to be merged very soon. And this one, I'm going to open a tab for this to make sure it's still waiting on author. I think that was the last status, but it's been quite a while. And I don't know about this one. Let's look at it real quick because this was not a complicated PR, right? John?
Yeah, so I think the issue with this one is that it breaks our tests. So I think
That would
the
be
first
bad.
thing we need to do is figure out how to not break our tests.
So we say waiting on author, but looks like they had the last comment, so I'm not sure that means.
Yeah, I would say it's not waiting on author.
Kind
It's
of
waiting on the maintainers to probably definitively close this.
So I would put that in the
like,
needs review bucket.
yeah.
I think that makes sense.
All right. And then blocked. This is blocked because there's not a base image for it yet, but it's not. There's no real urgency to this. And this is a new PR that chat has looked at, and I think we're waiting on author to add some tests, or did they do so? Oh, so I think we're needs review again, right?
Yeah, this was a simple. Go ahead and assign it to me. I'll review it right now. Otherwise, I'll lose it in the flood.
Right. All right, and then we had in progress. I assume this is still the case for all these, unless someone has different ideas. I think that's the triage page. Is that good enough for today, or is there anything else you want to look at? I'm seeing no
I think
dissenting.
it's fine.
Yeah. Okay.
It's fine. We have 10 minutes left in the meeting. I think we can call it good for now. It's fine.
All right. So unless anyone has any last minute things, we can call it good for this week. Going once, going twice. Cool. Thanks everybody for coming. See you here next week.
Thanks so much, Matt. Thanks for the demo, John.
Great demo.